black and brown to come together. ¿Me entiendes?
Just because you're a cop and I'm a con doesn't mean we can't cooperate. I can give you tips from inside that can really...
Cuval, salutations, and a clenched fist salute, my YouTube renegades. Welcome, y bienvenidos, once again, to the one and only Outlaw News. I am your host, the YouTube Magonista, the Cholo journalist, the voice of the barrio, the voice of the Waco Local, the voice of the voiceless. Que pasa, Cyber Raza? I hope all is well in Cyber Waco land, and everyone is here today, 113% activated, and came through strapped with their critical thinking beanies on extra tight. If so, it's time to jump in my Cyber Lolo and take a cruise to the dark side of YouTube. First, allow your boy the Outlaw to begin by apologizing for taking so long on dropping this content on one Joe Morgan and his alleged 1955 West Covina Bank Robbery. But the recent killing of Snitch Influencer Savage, plus the constant fake YouTube beefs from Snitch Influencers, which are being used to instigate racial and gang tensions today on social media, made me take a break from YouTube. These Snitch Influencers propaganda and fake PC soap opera drama starts to dumb one down after a while. One has to unplug from the rhetoric. Plus, unlike Snitch Influencers who don't work at all or have part-time jobs, plus law enforcement supplying and editing their content, your boy, the Outlaw, works a 50-plus hour work week. Also, the Outlaw is a full-time dad, not some part-time or deadbeat dad like most popular Snitch Influencers who claim they're about unity, but their private lives with their family proves they're obviously the wrong individuals to be trying to unify anyone. So it's quite a little more difficult for your boy, the Cholo journalist, to get enough free alone time to produce content. Today, though, the Outlaw will continue with the topic of one fabricated godfather criminal influencer, the infamous Joe Morgan, and his legendary 1955 West Covina Bank Robbery arrest, and what really happened to Morgan following his arrest for the West Covina Bank Robbery in 1955. The Outlaw first feels it's important to point out mainstream media, law enforcement, plus Snitch Influencers only say Joe Morgan was arrested for bank robbery. Arrested. This word will have a very significant role on how this entire video will end today, so make sure you stick around, Outlaw Posse. Also, it should be pointed out that celebrity snitch rapist influencer Boxer Enriquez's book, The Black Hand, claims one Morgan was shot in the leg during the alleged bank robbery in 1955, which will result in Morgan's leg being amputated. As you already know, Outlaw Renegades, Morgan was actually shot in the leg as a teen after trying to escape from authorities while on the run from a previous escape after Morgan was arrested on charges of killing Jose Rojo in 1946. So, pay attention today, Outlaw Posse, to see if you hear if in fact there was some brazen, daring shootout getaway attempt resulting in Morgan's leg being shot during the 1955 alleged West Covina Bank robbery, which Morgan supposedly committed if you listen to Snitch Influencers and mainstream media. My YouTube renegades, in today's video, the Outlaw will do what has never been done by any Snitch Influencer or law enforcement gang experts. The Outlaw will detail a full account of what actually happened to one criminal influencer, Joe Morgan, after his arrest for the alleged bank robbery. Plus, your boy, the Cholo journalist, will also reveal the name of the individual who was Morgan's suspected crime partner in the alleged West Covina holdup back in 1955. But before the outlaw reveals Morgan's crime partner's name, take a moment to hit the like and sub if you haven't already today done so. And don't be afraid to tell a righteous homie that there's finally a platform for individuals who refuse to be some snitch influencer fanboy or conform to their one-sided narrative on prison lore. With that said, Ernest B. Lopez, who is better known as Ernie, is the individual who was arrested with Joe Morgan for allegedly robbing the West Covina Bank of California for up to $17,000 back in 1955. Ernie is about 6 to 7 years older than Morgan, plus one of the original members of the East Los Angeles Maravilla barrio, the alleged unconfirmed barrio Morgan is supposedly belonged to. Ernie has just as long of a criminal history as Morgan. Ernie once served time in Alcatraz federal prison and was once a San Quentin death row inmate at one point during the 60s and early 70s. Ernie was also a very close friend of the majority of the founding MM members, such as Robot Salas, Kilroy, and Big D, plus Joe Morgan, just to name some. Ernie was closely associated with La M, and it is believed, but it has never been confirmed, that Ernie also belonged to La M, or was at least a very close associate of the organization while in prison. Ernie's also the same very individual who later in life will be charged with murder in 1960, in which Ernie has his lawyer subpoena Joe Morgan as a witness for his defense against his murder charges in 1961, resulting in Morgan's transfer from Folsom Prison to Los Angeles County Jail in 1961, in which Morgan will eventually lead a mass escape of inmates before testifying in Ernie's murder trial. The media, prosecutors, and law enforcement publicly would claim and would suspect Ernie Lopez of helping Morgan execute the daring jail escape by intentionally having Morgan transferred from Folsom Prison to Los Angeles County Jail so he can escape. So it's very clear that Ernie isn't just the suspected crime partner of Morgan during the alleged 1955 West Covina Bank Robbery, but is a friend of Morgan's and his inner circle of criminals. Now that the Outlaw has given you a brief bio on Ernie Lopez, let me tell you, Outlaw Renegades, another thing you will never hear talked about by the Snitch Influencer community, so-called gang experts, and the mainstream media. That one, Ernie Lopez, in fact, actually published a book on his life as a criminal in 2005 after his parole from prison. In his book, titled Alcatraz, Death Row and Back, Memories of an East LA Outlaw, specifically Chapter 12, titled My Life as a Free Man, one Ernie Lopez details what exactly happened to him and Joe Morgan during the alleged 1955 West Covina Bank Robbery. If any of you Outlaw Renegades ever remember watching the 1980s kid show Pee-wee's Playhouse, you may remember the Word of the Day game Pee-wee used to play with his audience.
So what's today's secret word, Cocky?
Today's secret word is
Drink.
star. Now,
You all remember what to do whenever anyone says the secret word, right?
scream!
Well, today, your boy the Outlaw will do the same with you. Our word of the day will be arrested. Again, you'll understand what the word of the day, arrested, has to do with today's lesson at the end of today's video. So make sure you stick around, Outlaw Renegades. But let's continue. What your boy the Outlaw is about to do is read a portion from the book to Alcatraz, Death Row and Back, Memories of an East LA Outlaw, again authored by the suspected crime partner of one Joe Morgan during the 1955 West Covina Bank Robbery, Ernie Lopez. The Outlaw wants you, Outlaw Renegades, to hear the whole full story of Joe Morgan and the alleged bank robbery that he would be arrested for. And again, I said arrested. Not just the entire story, but a first-hand account from his alleged crime partner, Ernie Lopez, rather than the typical, extremely biased, one-sided, very vague and brief narrative told by mainstream media, so-called gang experts, and the alleged anti-gang, gang-glorifying Snitch Influencer community when glamorizing one Joe Morgan's criminal exploits, such as Morgan's alleged 1955 West Covina Bank Robbery, which again, Box Enriquez claims one Joe Morgan was shot in the leg during the bank robbery. After I'm done reading the portion from the chapter 12 titled My Life as a Free Man, again from the book to Alcatraz, Death Row and Back, Memories of an East LA Outlaw, we'll chop it up, Outlaw Posse, about what really happened to Joe Morgan during the fairy tale of the alleged 1955 West Covina Bank robbery, and how the word of the day, arrested, factors in to how this alleged bank robbery fairy tale is manipulated to glamorize and glorify one Joe Morgan as the iconic criminal influencer of the Chicano culture, which Morgan happens to not be. Let's begin. The book starts as followed, again, reading from chapter 12, My Life as a Free Man.
The first time that I was haunted by Alcatraz came very soon after my release. My wife had divorced me while I was in Alcatraz, so I took a room alone in a duplex that sat on a narrow block where two streets came together in North Hollywood. At the very point of the block was a gas station where I made phone calls since I didn't have a phone of my own. As luck would have it, a pretty spectacular bank robbery took place in West Covina soon after I moved in. Two masked men had gone into the bank waving a machine gun around. They robbed the teller and took money from the vault before escaping. Nobody got hurt, but the robbery was a daring daylight job, so the newspapers splashed the story, including a rough sketch of the masked robbers all over the front page. At one time, some joker was going around saying that one of the bank robbers in the drawings looked like my friend, Joe Morgan, and that the other one looked like me. It didn't take long at all before the authorities heard these rumors, which became innumerado. I don't really know what that word is, but I'm sorry if I get it wrong. And finally, in their minds, fact, I became a possible suspect. The local FBI and the LAPD knew that I had just been released from Alcatraz, and they were itching to catch me doing something that would send me back behind bars. They were hoping to clear the books on the bank robbery, but they had no leads, so the easiest thing for them to do was pin the blame on me. When they finally did get around to arresting me, they made a huge production out of it in order to make themselves look good. On the day I was arrested, I was walking to the gas station to make a phone call. A swarm of officers descended on me. The operation had been set up because of a fellow by the name of Robert Castro Luna had told the cops where I lived. I found out later that Luna had a long history as a police informant, one that would end up getting me into trouble even deeper down the line. I first met Luna at his sister's apartment in Los Angeles, near Washington and Normandy. Luna was living there at the time. Joe Morgan and I had gone over because Joe had agreed to meet a business partner at the apartment. We walked up to the second-story apartment and were let in. A group that included Luna and his brother were sitting in the kitchen and talking about some deal that had to do with some cocaine. We were introduced to everyone, and Luna's brother wanted to continue their conversation in another room so that we could be left alone in the kitchen. Considering the topic of conversation, I didn't think there was anything particularly wrong with this. I didn't know these guys from Adam, and they certainly didn't know me. But Robert Luna told his brother that if they were going to talk, they were going to talk in front of me, or he wasn't going to listen. Luna apparently had heard about me and had told his brother that I could be trusted. The two brothers finally settled down to discuss business in the kitchen. Joe spoke with the guy he had come to see, and I thought nothing more about it. Sometime later, I ran across Luna again when I happened into a cocktail lounge called the Airliner. I had walked in late at night to make a call and use the restroom, and as I was leaving, he and his girlfriend called me over. She was a very good-looking girl who said she was from Colorado. I told her that I had just been to Denver, and she asked me where I had stayed. The Ritz, I told her. She said, "Oh, big spender," and smiled. I don't know what Ritz she was talking about, but the only classy thing about that dump I stayed in was the name. We chatted like that for a while, but I had no interest in remaining there. When I left, they followed me out and asked if I could give them a ride home. I had heard by then that the authorities were looking for me in connection with the West Covina Bank Robbery, so I didn't really want Luna to know the kind of car I was driving, which was a nice little brand new Plymouth. There was nothing I could do without looking suspicious, so I had no choice but to drive the two home. They asked me first to drop off Luna's girlfriend, who lived on North Broadway. I parked right in front of her house. Luna opened the car door and took her by the arm, telling me that he would be right back. Guided her into the dark house while I sat in the car. I waited and finally got fed up and tooted the horn. Sometime after that, Luna finally came out. He told me some story that they had had a fight and that's why he had taken so long. It was getting late and I wanted to get home, so I headed down the Harbor Freeway to take him home. As we were driving along, Luna all of a sudden asked me to drop him off at the corner of Normandy and Washington, rather than take him all the way home to his apartment. I figured he wanted a hamburger because there was a little stand there at the corner. I dropped him off and he walked away. As I was turning into the parking lot to turn around to get back on the freeway, I decided to get a cup of coffee for the long drive back to North Hollywood. When I walked to the front of the stand, I found to my surprise that Luna wasn't there. I then went around the corner to the side street where I saw Luna in a telephone booth. He was talking on the phone, looking nervously over his shoulder every now and then. When he saw me, he slammed down the receiver. I didn't know whom he was talking to or why he seemed so nervous, and didn't really think that much about it at the time, but I soon found out who was on the other end of the line. On a warm June morning in 1956, I went to make a phone call at the gas station. Immediately I could sense that I was being followed. As I was walking towards the gas station, which was on the narrow edge of the knife wedge block, I could hear a car rolling slowly across the gravel and the ping of pebbles hitting the fenders. I didn't want to turn around and appear suspicious, so I kept walking, looking for possible escape routes. At the gas station ahead of me, I spotted a car. 4 men with hats sat in it, 2 in the front and 2 in the back. It was so obvious that they were agents that I found it funny. When they saw me looking at them, they all turned away or slumped down in their seats. Now I actually laughed. Just as I got to the gas station driveway, the car that had been following me rolled up onto the sidewalk. The head FBI agent in LA, a man by the name of John Malone, opened the car door, jumped out, and pulled a Thompson submachine gun right up to my chest, stopping me dead in my tracks. I said to him, "What the hell is going on? Are you guys gangsters?" He didn't appear amused. "What's your name?" he barked. I gave him a false name. Malone reached around to my back pocket to pull out my wallet, where he found an ID that matched the phony name. Now he looked more confused than furious. He thought he had somehow stopped the wrong guy. Just then, another agent by the name of Jones shouted out to Malone, that's him, I recognize him. It seems Jones had been out to my duplex not long before trying to find my friend from Alcatraz, Mike Strigano, who was suspected of shooting a cop. So Jones knew my face and he started shouting into the radio, close in, we got Ernie Lopez. He kept shouting to Malone, that's him. At that, all these cops came running over. They were swarming in from everywhere. They came running out of a house, out of cars, from around the alleyways. They must have been 50 cops with rifles drawn and guns unholstered. And they all came running out to surround me. There were so many cops to arrest me that I got to feeling just a little special. Jones confirmed my identity, so my best efforts at throwing the cops off my tracks failed. I finally had to admit who I was. They wanted to know where I lived, but I wanted them as far away from my apartment as possible. So I told them that I lived in Long Beach. They, of course, didn't believe me and sent someone to the gas station to question the attendant about me. He pointed out where he thought I lived, and the FBI went over, but knocked on the wrong door. They barged into an apartment occupied by a young woman who at that moment had just stepped completely naked out of the shower. When this band of agents came storming into her room with their guns drawn, she started screaming bloody murder. I would have loved to see the faces on those cops then. It was only a matter of time before they found my actual apartment, and they dragged me over while they searched my rooms. There was a large group of them searching everywhere and turning everything over. They were like a bunch of horses, clomping clumsy around my little apartment. I was cuffed, seated on the sofa. 2 cops close by me were assigned to keep an eye on me. I was getting a little nervous as the search went on because the night before, I had hidden a huge wad of money in one of those sofa pillows. Most of the cops were in the kitchen and the bedroom at the time, but I knew that sooner or later they were going to find the money. I leaned back and crossed my legs, trying to make myself comfortable, when one of the police watching me barked, "Put your legs down." I put my legs down. Just then, one of the cops came from the kitchen to the living room and absentmindedly picked up the very pillow in which I had stashed the money. Suddenly, I made a big show of crossing my legs again. The same cop yelled, "Put your legs down." I leaped up in rage. "God damn you, you motherfucker. Who the fuck are you to tell me not to cross my legs?" All the cops came rushing to see what the commotion was all about. The one who was holding the pillow set it back down, ready to jump in case I started to get rough. I was yelling at the guy, "You goddamn yellow son of a bitch. You got all these goddamn cops with you. You're scared to death because I got my knees over my fucking leg? Fuck you." I was making as much racket as I could. Malone came rushing in. "Take it easy, Ernie. Come on, I know you. Take it easy. Everything's gonna be alright." Slowly, I sat down and made it as if I was trying to control myself. The cops got back to searching the place, and pretty soon one of the agents started shouting, I got it here. Look at what I found." He had found a clip to a grease gun, which is a type of a machine gun whose handle looks like those grease guns used in garages. He got very excited with this discovery because the bank robbers had used the machine gun in the heist. However, the robbers had used a Tommy gun, not a grease gun, which is much more cheaply made. They all went rushing over, wanting to see what he found. Now they started looking for the actual grease gun, which I didn't have in the apartment, so it didn't matter to me if they searched for the gun all day. At least they were no longer interested in the pillow. Eventually they finished their search and took me to the old county jail. As the agents led me in to be booked, one of them commented, "Boy, Ernie, we almost had you the other night." Yeah, it was right around 2 o'clock in the morning over on the Harbor Freeway by Normandy. We were driving around and around looking for you, but we must have just missed you. So Luna phoned the police that night by the hamburger stand. Now I was certain that he was the one who had led the cops to my car in my apartment. The police found me only because they had used Luna's description to identify my car. As I said, this was not the last time I got in trouble because of Robert Luna. With all the commotion over the grease clip, they never did find the money in the pillow. As soon as I could, I sent a trusted friend of mine back to the apartment. I told him where I hid the key, and he let himself into the apartment and got the money. Instead of just grabbing the money though, he took the whole pillow with him. So later on, my landlord gave me a hell of a time about the missing pillow, refusing to release my things to me. He kept insisting, "You owe me for this missing pillow." I told him, "I don't have it. Maybe a goddamn agent took your pillow. If I don't get my pillow, you don't get your stuff." I ended up paying something like $20 to the landlord so that I could get my clothes and other possessions out of my apartment. To prepare my defense, I got this rather famous lawyer by the name of Alan Ross to represent me. As soon as he could, Ross came over to the jail to talk. He told me that the bank had asked all its employees not to speak to anybody about the case. So he was having a hell of a time getting information. He told me he knew a good guy, a reliable investigator, who would surely get information. I told this to Joe Morgan, who also had been picked up by then, and we agreed that it would be a good idea to get the investigator. He was this little guy whose fee seemed pretty reasonable, I think about $75 a day, so Joe and I hired him. The investigator turned out to be pretty slick. He normally worked for insurance companies, which is how I guess he got to be so slick. He first went to the bank in West Covina, but nobody would talk to him. Apparently the FBI, as well as the bank, had instructed the witnesses not to say a word to anyone. So he got nowhere fast trying to talk to the bank employees. As he was driving away from the bank, he got pulled over by a couple of cops. When he asked why they had stopped him, they said it was for speeding. I was going about 5 miles an hour. How can you say I was speeding? He refused to tell the cops who he was, so they took him in. They kept him detained for about 3 to 4 hours, suspicious of anyone who would come around asking questions about the robbery. He kept telling them, "I'm an investigator. I'm investigating the case." In the end, they probably figured out since he was an investigator, he would probably turn out to be more trouble than he was worth, so eventually they turned him loose. The whole incident really got him mad, and it stoked his desire to investigate this case. For him, this wasn't just a job anymore, it had become something a little personal. His next scheme was to read all newspaper stories about the bank robbery. He gathered names of several of the people mentioned as witnesses and used the phone book to find their numbers and addresses. After work hours, he went to their houses one by one. He would knock on the door and tell the employees that he was an insurance investigator, investigating the bank robbery. This was the truth though. He failed to mention that he was investigating a robbery for us, not the bank's insurance company. He would tell the employees, "I just want to know the truth about what happened, who saw what, who can identify whom." Then he would run down a list of questions about the robbery. Could the employees identify any of the suspects? What happened when the suspects entered the bank? Did they hurt anybody? A whole range of questions to find out what the witnesses might know. The investigator learned that both the robbers wore masks, so none of the employees were able to describe them adequately to the police. They came in very quick. One held a Tommy gun, the other jumped over the counter to collect the money from the vault. A number of witnesses noted that he was very agile and leaped on the counter with little effort. They also emphasized how polite the robbers were and that nobody got hurt. He wrote down every bit of information the witnesses offered. He then had the witness read over the statement he had just written and sign the paper at the bottom, affirming it as truth. He went through the whole list of witnesses this way. It was the only means we had of getting the depositions necessary to form our case. In the meantime, I was laid over in the jail. Alan Ross would come around every now and then and tell me the district attorney either had a really strong case against us or had absolutely nothing. Either way, he couldn't learn anything about the case without access to the witnesses. Finally, Ross decided, you know what? I don't have to fool around with these goddamn bank people anymore. You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna hit them with the subpoena. We found a law on the books under a section titled Perpetual Testimony. It seems that if there's any possibility that testimony may disappear or be destroyed, or if some Someone's recollection may be lost. An attorney can get a court order to preserve that testimony. So Ross went to the federal court and had the judge issue an order to a state judge to subpoena all witnesses to the bank robbery. Using this end run, we finally managed to get sworn depositions for the case. Rather than meet with witnesses in court, Ross had them come to his office in groups of 3 or 4. Each group came to their office, was accompanied by an attorney provided by the bank. Ross told each group that he wanted to make the process very easy. He was not going to ask any embarrassing questions or irrelevant questions. All he wanted was to assert the truth. He was trying to ease their concerns, letting them know they weren't in trouble and weren't going to get into any. He then led them through a series of very specific questions about the case. He asked them about the lineup procedure. It turned out that they all had been interviewed by the FBI before they went into the lineup. The FBI had told the witnesses that I was the prime suspect in the robbery and would be in the lineup. All they had to do was point me out in order to make the case conclusive. The agents also told them that I just came out of the penitentiary and that though I had never been convicted of it, I was a murderer as well as a thief. There had been 4 of us in the lineup. Me, 3 barefooted kids who must have been no older than 12. Of course the witnesses knew that the young kids didn't rob the bank. Since they had been told that the prime suspect was in the lineup, they had no choice but to identify me as the culprit. It became pretty obvious that the DA had no indictments against either Joe or me. But we were taken before a U.S. commissioner anyways. Ross asked that the case against us be dismissed for lack of evidence, since there was no prima facie case. I don't know if I said that right. Prima facie case. Again, I apologize. The district attorney said that if the commissioner would wait a day, he would be able to get a grand jury indictment against the 2 of us. Sure enough, the next day, he got an indictment. The grand jury is composed of prosecutors anyways, so they suspect everyone. They are more than happy to indict almost any suspect. After several more weeks passed, we went to court to submit a plea. The day when pleas are submitted can be pretty chaotic. During a trial, everything proceeds in a dignified and orderly fashion. But on plea day, people walk in and out of the court with their attorneys, marshals hustle along the aisles, lawyers consult with their clients, run around making deals with the prosecution. No jury is seated. Instead, the jury box is occupied by the group of prisoners waiting to make their pleas. On this day, I was sitting in the bottom row of the jury box, and Joe was behind me in the top row. There was a probation officer running from here to there, questioning people. He would ask each prisoner a series of questions and write down the answers on a little tablet. Soon he came over to where I was seated, and he called out, "Ernie Lopez? Ernie Lopez." I was there sitting directly in front of him, but I didn't answer. The probation officer went over to the marshals and asked him if he had a guy by the name of Ernie Lopez. The marshal looked at him. "Yeah, he's sitting right in front of you." The probation officer looked at me and came back. "Are you Ernest Lopez?" I still didn't answer, but he carried on anyways. "Okay, Ernie, what's your mother's name?" He asked me a whole series of questions that I refused to answer. Finally I said, "Get the fuck out of my face, you punk. Get the fuck away from me." He was startled, but said, "Now, Ernie, you shouldn't have a chip on your shoulder. The federal court will give you a fair trial." "Fair my ass. Just get the fuck out of my face." He had no right trying to get information about me from probation before I had even been tried. He was just trying to cut corners and save himself more work later when probation was granted. The probation officer gave up and looked back at his list. He started calling Joe's name. "Joseph Morgan? Joseph Morgan?" Joe had already seen what I did, and he didn't answer the officer. Again, the guy went to the marshal to ask if he had anybody by the name of Joseph Morgan. "Yeah," the marshal smirked. "He's right there above Ernie." When he came back to talk to Joe, Joe started from his chair as if we were going to grab him, shouting, "You motherfucker, get the hell out of here, you goddamn son of a bitch." That got rid of the probation officer. We had all our motions to make at the argument, and we pleaded not guilty. Finally, we were ready to set a date for trial. The judge tried to find a trial date agreeable to the defense and the prosecution. There were many dates unacceptable to the government because it turned out the federal prosecutor, Lon Waters, was going to try this case. Waters was a tall guy, maybe 6'7" or 6'8", and a rising star in the federal circuit. Because he was such a big shot, scheduling was very difficult. The judge would say, "How about the 23rd of July?" Ross would say, "That's permissible by me." One of the prosecutors would say, "Nope, the 23rd on July is not permissible because Attorney Waters will be in Washington, D.C. Attorney Waters very specifically said he wants to try this case personally." Alan Ross was a great trial lawyer, but he had one flaw. He talked too loud. So when he heard the prosecutor say that Waters would be trying this case, everyone in the courtroom heard Ross laugh and say, "Well, that's good for us. He's never tried a case in his life." The prosecutor got mad at the disrespect and snapped back. He'll, of course, get help. Ross turned to me and said even louder, "Well, he's gonna need a lot of help." Well, we're sitting there trying to set a court date. Joe Morgan hits me on the elbow and leans over. He said, "Mira los calcetines del abogado." So I looked at Ross's socks, and the tops were unraveling. It looked as if you could pull on a string and the whole sock would come completely undone. Joseph said to me in Spanish, "You know what? I'm going to give him the clothes I had in the motel when they arrested me. I'm going to give him a lot of socks. Maybe while I'm at it, I'll give him some nice looking suits too." I don't know if Ross ever took Joe up on his offer, but he sure could have used it. Anyways, they finally set a date for trial. On Monday, that the trial began, I sat in the holding pen. Trial dates: you are allowed to have a dress shirt, a tie, and on trial days, you're allowed to have a dress shirt, tie, and your shoes. The rest of your clothes, your coat, and your pants have to be put on in the bathroom just before your appearance. So that morning, I had my tie, my shirt on, and I was just waiting to get called out. The officer came down and called out the names of the guys going to court first. He called out about 6 or 7 names, but I wasn't among them. I didn't know if they had called Joe to trial because we were both being held in separate tanks. Something seemed wrong to me. Since I knew that we were supposed to stand trial first thing in the morning, I informed the sheriff, and he told me that my name was not on the list. "Maybe you're scheduled for afternoon." I waited till 1 o'clock when the same thing happened and my name wasn't called. I thought that maybe I would be called at 2. Even if they were going to postpone the court date, they would have to take me to appear in court so that all the parties could agree to a postponement. I knew something was definitely wrong. Finally, Ross came around to see me. His face was red and he looked steaming mad. He shouted even louder than he usually did. "You know what? What those sons of bitches did? They dismissed your case without notifying me. They didn't even have the courtesy to call me. I knew they didn't have a fucking thing on you. After going through all the contortions of settling on a court date, they threw in the towel. Neither Joe nor I went to court." Ross was so mad that he was particularly smoking from the ears. I told him, "Well, Ross, you may be mad, but this is goddamn good news to me." It wasn't until much later that we learned how the feds had got the indictment against me. An FBI agent had gone before the grand jury and testified that John Doe had told another John Doe that another John Doe had said he believed Ernie Lopez and Joe Morgan had robbed a bank in West Covina. All this information was third-person hearsay, but the grand jury accepted it and issued the indictment. As I said, grand juries are composed of prosecutors, and most of them would happily indict a wall. The hearsay was inadmissible because in 1956, the feds had brought a case against a big-time gambler from New York by the name of Frank Costello. The feds relied on hearsay evidence to indict him, then arrested him on charges of income tax evasion. He went to the Supreme Court to prove that the government had no grounds for the indictment. The courts ruled that any kind of evidence, even hearsay, is admissible when securing a federal indictment. Only during a trial is hearsay or illegal evidence not admissible. So Joe and I were indicted on the strength of Costello versus the United States. I was awaiting my release when my parole officer, a man by the name of, ironically enough, Freeman, came to see me. He was not, of course, the same Harry Freeman of the LAPD who had tormented me years before. To my surprise, he told me I wasn't going to be released, then ran down a list of supposed parole infractions I had committed before being arrested for the bank robbery. This was all news to me. I insisted to him that I had done none of these things I was accused of. I reminded him that I had reported to him and ordered every month, and I had told him where I lived, where I worked, and every other kind of information he wanted from me. He said that if this was the case, there would be no grounds for parole violation. Listen, Ernie, he said, if what you said is true, then I promise I'll turn you loose. I ain't got nothing against you. If you come out all right on these violations, you'll be out on the streets. A few days later, Freeman came back to see me. He looked long. A few days later, Freeman came back to see me. He had a look long in his face. I'm sorry, Ernie. I have to violate you. I can't let them turn you loose. What are you violating me for? I demanded. He said, well, it's not my fault, you know, but I got a boss, and I gotta do what he tells me to do. Okay. My problem was the result of Freeman's carelessness. Though I was reporting regularly, my report wasn't getting to him. All along, he knew where I was, where I lived, and where I was working, but the reports weren't going in, and he never followed through, so the violations were actually his fault, and he admitted as much. This was the reason he was willing to turn me loose, but the chief parole officer, a man by the name of Van Meter, who ordered Freeman to charge me with the violation of parole, and part of the violation was because of a priest named Father Clark, whom I had met in Alcatraz. He was very close to Van Meter and had become pretty well known because of his acquaintances with Howard Hughes and other celebrities. He also would often go to Alcatraz and offer counsel to the big names there, Machine Gun Kelly, Freddie Horn, and Alvin Karpis. Among them, every now and then, you would see him walk up and down the yard, talk with one of the better-known convicts. I got to know Father Clark in Alcatraz because I was to appear before a committee he sat on. This committee reviewed your case. If you happened to lose a recommendation or transfer, or if you lost time off for good behavior, the escape of McNeil had cost me 500 days of good time, and I was appealing to get some of it back. It had been almost 10 years since the escape. Even Alvin Karpis put in a good word for me with Father Clark. I went before the committee, and a number of people talked about how I was working and how I got along with everybody. When Father Clark saw me, he expressed surprise at my behavior. I didn't know you were behaving and getting along so well. They really said some great things about you before the committee. As a result, gave me my good time back, which was the reason for the conditional release from Alcatraz and my return to LA. After the bank robbery charges against me were dropped, I was remanded to county jail, where I was detained until the whole issue of my parole violation could be worked out. Father Clark never did put in a good word for me with Van Meter, so the board charged me with the violation of parole, and I was sent back to Alcatraz for 2.5 more years.
So there it is, my outlaw posse. Joe Morgan never ever stood trial for the alleged holdup of the West Covina Bank of California, supposedly stealing up to $17,000 with his alleged crime partner, Ernie Lopez. In fact, there was little to no evidence to begin with to actually prove that one Joe Morgan and Ernie Lopez even robbed the West Covina Bank of California back in 1955. Yet, we, the naive, gullible public, outlaw renegades, drink the Snitch Influencer and mainstream media Kool-Aid every day and believe the fabricated gangster status fairy tales of one non-Chicano Joe Morgan, instead of being told the truth that in fact, one Joe Morgan turned state's evidence against his Latina lover Elvira Rojo back in 1946 and was never convicted or even stood trial for allegedly robbing the West Covina Bank of California with Ernie Lopez back in 1955. Now Morgan was actually sent back to prison in 1956 on parole violations, not bank robbery, which is why Joe Morgan never went to federal prison and was sent to a state prison instead. Because Outlaw Renegades, you might not know, but bank robbery is actually a federal crime since 1934, requiring an individual convicted of bank robbery to serve time at a federal facility, not a state prison like San Quentin or Folsom. Joe was actually sent back on violating his parole because upon his arrest for bank robbery, law enforcement searched his room and found drugs and drug paraphernalia. Yes, my Outlaw Renegades, another damaging piece of information about Morgan, which mainstream media, gang experts, and the popular Snitch Influencer community forget to mention when glamorizing one Joe Morgan, the non-Chicano influencer of the Chicano gang culture. That he, Morgan, is in fact and has always been a habitual heroin addict. Maybe because it becomes harder to sell the fabricated image to us, the naive public, of Morgan, the highly sophisticated, super disciplined, intelligent gangster godfather, if we knew he was a full-blown heroin addict. And this has all been possible because the mainstream media plus the Snitch Influencer community have since day one misinformed and intentionally withheld or manipulated important facts about specific incidents used to build the fabricated image of one Joe Morgan, the non-Chicano criminal influencer godfather of the Chicano urban soft culture. Basically, the Snitch Influencer community and their puppet masters have been brainwashing and indoctrinating us for years to believe intentionally glorified fairy tales about the infamous Joe Morgan and Joe Morgan's alleged 1955 bank robbery is a perfect example of how they've been able to brainwash us, the naive public, Outlaw Renegades, to believe the prison fairy tale about Morgan. It's all been possible by withholding information about Morgan's 1955 bank robbery, only telling brief, vague stories about the bank robbery, especially by using the Outlaw's word of the day, arrested, to describe Morgan's 1955 alleged bank holdup. What the Snitch Influencer community, gang experts, and mainstream media have done wasn't by luck, Outlaw Renegades. In fact, it's actually a scientifically proven theory by several renowned scientists, such as University's Irvine's Elizabeth Loftus, a world-renowned neurologist, whose misinformation effect, theory, and experiments have proven countless times that individuals, and specifically large groups of people, can be influenced to believe a false narrative of a real event or situations, such as witnessing a car accident, by using alleged professional type people who the experimental subjects believe to be knowledgeable leading experts or people of authority regarding car accidents.
I study people who remember things that didn't happen or remember things differently from the way they actually occurred. So in one of the paradigms that I've used for studying memory, what we do is we show people a simulated crime or an accident, and then we might try to deliberately feed them some misinformation about what they experienced. So they might see the car go through a yield sign, and we suggest to them that it's a stop sign. And what happens when people are exposed to this misinformation is sometimes they will adopt it as their own memory and become convinced of it. So they'll now tell you, I saw a stop sign. They might be confident about it and detailed about it, even though it's a distorted detail. Then what we did is, to see just how far you can go with people, we tried to plant entirely false memories into the minds of people for things that didn't happen. And we were able, through the power of suggestion, to convince people, for example, that they were lost in a shopping mall when they were 5 years old. And the take-home message from all this is that just because somebody tells you something with a lot of detail and confidence and emotion, it doesn't mean that it really happened.
Such as we, the naive public outlaw renegades, do every day by believing habitual lying snitch influencers and unreliable mainstream media news outlets, prison boogeyman fairy tales, without requiring proof in the form of documentation to corroborate their claims. The snitch influencer community, mainstream media, and the so-called gang experts have manipulated and fabricated the myth of Greek godlike super gangster, criminal influencer Joe Morgan since day one by repeatedly referring to Morgan's 1955 bank robbery as Morgan being arrested for bank robbery. By them simply using the words such as arrested, they have for decades brainwashed us, the naive public outlaw posse, to believe and assume Morgan went to prison for the 1955 bank robbery, when in fact that is completely false, outlaw renegades. Until today, most of you outlaw posse have been under the assumption that Morgan was convicted of bank robbery. Until today, you probably believed anything and everything the snitch influencer community and the fake news have to say about Joe Morgan. That's until the outlaw made you use your critical thinking skills today, right? So don't forget to like and hit the sub button today and become part of the outlaw posse in resisting snitch influencer conformity and their lies. On my next video, Outlaw Renegades, I will continue with the unauthorized profile on one fabricated criminal influencer of the Chicano subculture, one Joe Morgan, and begin to detail his 1961 LA County jail escape, which is an incident that Morgan was actually involved in and didn't snitch on somebody. So like always, keep them Cortezes laced up and your critical thinking beanies on at all times, Outlaw Posse, and always stay activated 113%, because there's a war out for your minds, YouTube renegades, and only way to fight it is to be an outlaw. As always, a clenched fist salute y venceremos.